April 1st, 1945. Dawn breaks over the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. Through the morning mist rising from the Rhine River, American commanders peer through binoculars at what appears to be the largest prize of the entire European war. Spread across the Ruhr Valley, the smoking chimneys and massive steel mills that had fed Hitler's war machine for 6 years stretched to the horizon. 370,000 German soldiers from Army Group B huddle in defensive positions throughout the region, trapped between converging American armies. Field Marshal Walter Model, Hitler's most trusted defensive commander, stands in his headquarters studying maps that tell a story no German general wanted to face. His forces are completely surrounded. The 9th U.S. Army has sealed the northern approaches, while the 1st U.S. Army controls the southern routes. For the first time in the war, an entire German army group finds itself in a position from which escape is impossible. But what happens next would shock both sides and reveal a truth that Nazi propaganda had desperately tried to conceal. The Americans expect a fight to the death. German doctrine demanded it. Hitler's explicit orders forbade surrender under any circumstances. Model himself had earned his reputation as the Führer's fireman, the general who could salvage impossible situations through sheer determination and tactical brilliance. Yet, within 18 days, over 300,000 of Germany's remaining soldiers would choose surrender over continued resistance, not because they were cowards, but because they had seen something that shattered every assumption about German military superiority and American weakness. The question that haunted American intelligence officers was simple but profound. Why would nearly 500,000 German troops, many of them veterans of brutal Eastern Front campaigns, choose capitulation when they still possessed substantial weapons, ammunition, and defensive advantages? The answer lay not in a single moment of collapse, but in a psychological transformation that had been building since the Americans crossed the Rhine River. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand the magnitude of what occurred in the Ruhr Pocket, we must first grasp what these German forces represented. This was not a collection of green recruits or demoralized conscripts. Army Group B contained the remnants of units that had terrorized Europe for 5 years. The 15th Army under General Gustav Adolf von Zangen included veterans of the Atlantic Wall defenses. The 5th Panzer Army retained experienced tank crews who had fought across Russia and France. These formations had been systematically retreating from the Rhine River since American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7th. For 3 weeks, they had conducted fighting withdrawals through territory they knew intimately, utilizing every defensive advantage the industrial landscape provided. Coal mines became underground fortresses. Steel mills offered concealment for anti-tank guns. Railroad embankments created natural barriers that should have slowed American advances for months. But something unprecedented was happening to German military performance that their commanders struggled to understand. Units that had previously fought with fanatical determination were surrendering after minimal resistance. Battalions that should have held defensive positions for days were abandoning their weapons and seeking American lines under white flags. Most disturbing from a German perspective was the complete absence of the tactical cohesion that had characterized Wehrmacht operations since 1939. Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway of the 18th Airborne Corps compiled intelligence reports that painted a picture of systematic military collapse unlike anything American forces had previously encountered. German prisoners described scenes within their own formations that seemed to contradict everything they had been taught about military honor and national duty. Officers who had maintained discipline through years of Eastern Front brutality were unable to comprehend how American forces had achieved such overwhelming tactical superiority. The material evidence of German demoralization was visible everywhere American patrols advanced. Abandoned equipment told the story of formations that had disintegrated rather than retreated. Personal belongings scattered along roadsides indicated hasty flight rather than organized withdrawal. Most tellingly, the absence of prepared demolitions suggested that German engineers had neither time nor inclination to deny infrastructure to advancing American forces. Field Marshal Model faced a crisis that extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. Radio. Communications with Hitler's headquarters revealed the growing disconnect between political expectations and military realities. The Führer continued to demand counterattacks and breakthrough operations despite clear evidence that Army Group B lacked the capability for offensive action. More critically, Hitler's refusal to acknowledge the hopelessness of the strategic situation made rational military planning impossible. The psychological impact on German troops was evident in intercepted radio transmissions between unit commanders. Conversations that American signals intelligence recorded revealed a complete breakdown in confidence that the war could be won. Officers who had previously demonstrated absolute loyalty to Nazi ideology were openly questioning whether continued resistance served any meaningful purpose. The myth of German military invincibility, which had sustained Wehrmacht morale through 4 years of increasingly difficult campaigns, was crumbling in the face of systematic defeat by American forces. Model's own assessment of the situation reflected the broader crisis within German military leadership. His after-action reports to higher headquarters described tactical conditions that made continued resistance tantamount to suicide. American artillery superiority exceeded anything German doctrine had anticipated. Close air support by American fighter bombers made daylight movement impossible. Most critically, the absence of German reserves meant that any breakthrough by American forces could not be contained or counterattacked. The human dimension of German collapse became apparent as American interrogation teams compiled testimony from prisoners captured during the initial phases of the encirclement. These were not teenage conscripts or reluctant foreign volunteers, but career soldiers, whose military experience spanned multiple campaigns. Their descriptions of combat against American forces revealed a fundamental shift in the tactical balance that went far beyond questions of equipment or numbers. German veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived the brutal attritional warfare against Soviet forces, described American combat effectiveness in terms that seemed almost incredulous. The coordination between infantry, artillery, and armor exceeded anything they had encountered in previous campaigns. The speed with which American forces could concentrate overwhelming firepower at decisive points made traditional German defensive tactics obsolete. More significantly, these experienced soldiers recognized that American tactical doctrine had evolved far beyond the capabilities they had faced in North Africa or Sicily. The men attacking German positions in the Ruhr were not the Green troops who had struggled during Operation Torch. They were veterans of Normandy and the subsequent campaigns, hardened by months of continuous combat and trained in combined arms tactics that maximized American industrial advantages while minimizing German strengths. The material superiority of American forces was apparent in every engagement within the Ruhr Pocket. German units that had been reduced to counting individual artillery rounds watched American batteries deliver sustained bombardments that lasted for hours. Panzer crews operating vehicles with mechanical failures and no replacement parts faced American armor that seemed to possess unlimited fuel and ammunition. Infantry formations that had been supplemented by teenage Volkssturm militia encountered American soldiers equipped with weapons and equipment that represented the pinnacle of industrial warfare. Captain Heinrich Springer of the 12th SS Panzer Division filed situation reports that captured the growing desperation within German formations. His unit, which had entered the war as an elite formation capable of independent operations, had been reduced to fewer than 300 combat-effective personnel. The division's armor strength had declined, from over 100 operational tanks to fewer than 20 vehicles, most of which lacked adequate fuel for sustained operations. The strategic implications of German weakness extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Intelligence assessments compiled by American staff officers recognized that the forces trapped within the Ruhr Pocket represented Germany's final strategic reserve in the Western theater. The destruction or capture of Army Group B would eliminate any possibility of organized resistance west of the Elbe River. More critically, the loss of the Ruhr's industrial capacity would end Germany's ability to produce the weapons and equipment necessary for continued military operations. General Omar Bradley's tactical approach to reducing the Ruhr Pocket demonstrated the maturation of American military doctrine during the European campaign. Rather than attempting to storm German positions through costly frontal assaults, his forces implemented a systematic strategy. of encirclement and attrition that maximized American advantages while minimizing casualties. The coordination between multiple army corps created a ring of steel around German positions that tightened inexorably with each passing day. The psychological warfare component of American operations proved as effective as conventional military action. Loudspeakers broadcasting surrender appeals in German created a constant reminder that resistance was futile. Leaflets dropped by American aircraft provided detailed information about prisoner treatment that contradicted Nazi propaganda about Allied brutality. Most effectively, the simple fact that increasing numbers of German soldiers were choosing surrender over death demonstrated that alternatives to fanatical resistance existed. Model's command decisions during the early phases of the encirclement revealed both his tactical skill and the impossibility of his strategic position. His attempts to concentrate remaining armor for breakout operations were frustrated by American air superiority that made large-scale troop movements impossible during daylight hours. His efforts to establish defensive lines, utilizing the industrial terrain, were undermined by ammunition shortages that limited sustained resistance to major American attacks. The breakdown in German logistics became a critical factor that accelerated military collapse throughout the Ruhr Pocket. Supply lines that had been stretched to breaking point since the retreat from the Rhine River finally snapped under the pressure of complete encirclement. Food rations were reduced to starvation levels. Ammunition distribution became so irregular that some units possessed artillery without shells, while others had small arms ammunition, but no weapons to fire it. Medical services, which had maintained functionality throughout previous campaigns despite enormous casualties, ceased to operate effectively as American forces captured supply depots and transportation networks. Wounded German soldiers faced the choice between death from lack of treatment or surrender to American medical personnel who possessed adequate supplies and facilities. For many German troops, this choice represented their first direct experience with the material abundance that characterized American military operations. The weather conditions during early April 1945 created additional hardships for German forces that lacked adequate equipment and supplies. Cold rain and mud made defensive positions uncomfortable and unhealthy for troops who had been operating on reduced rations for weeks. American forces, protected by superior equipment and supplied through logistics networks that continued to function despite difficult conditions, maintained combat effectiveness while their enemies suffered from exposure and malnutrition. Individual German soldiers began to question the fundamental assumptions that had sustained their resistance throughout the war. The superiority of German weapons and tactics, which Nazi propaganda had proclaimed as absolute truth, was contradicted by daily experience of tactical defeat. The invincibility of German military organization crumbled as unit cohesion disintegrated under pressure that exceeded anything experienced in previous campaigns. Captain Klaus Weber, of the 116th Panzer Division, compiled a situation report on April 10th that captured the psychological transformation occurring within German formations. His battalion, which had begun the war with full strength and high morale, could muster fewer than 100 combat-effective personnel. More critically, the soldiers under his command had lost confidence in their ability to achieve victory through continued resistance. Weber's assessment reflected observations that were becoming common throughout Army Group B. German troops, who had previously demonstrated exceptional courage under fire, were increasingly reluctant to engage American forces unless absolutely necessary. The tactical initiative had passed completely to American commanders, who could choose when and where to attack, while German forces remained trapped in static defensive positions. The industrial landscape of the Ruhr, which should have provided excellent defensive terrain for determined troops, became a liability as American forces systematically captured key facilities. Coal mines that could have served as underground fortresses were abandoned when their entrances were sealed by American engineers. Steel mills that offered concealment for defensive positions became death traps when American artillery concentrated fire on buildings that could not be evacuated quickly. Model's radio communications with subordinate commanders during the second week of April revealed the growing impossibility of maintaining organized resistance. Unit reports described ammunition shortages that made sustained combat impossible. Food supplies had declined to the point where malnutrition was affecting combat effectiveness. Most critically, the psychological state of German troops had deteriorated to levels that made reliable execution of military orders questionable. The American response to German weakness demonstrated tactical sophistication that exceeded German expectations based on previous encounters. Rather than exploiting apparent vulnerabilities through hasty attacks that might have resulted in unnecessary casualties, American commanders maintained steady pressure that allowed German resistance to collapse gradually. This approach maximized American advantages while minimizing the risk of desperate counterattacks that could have inflicted significant losses. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Sink of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment observed German defensive preparations that revealed the scope of their deteriorating capabilities. Positions that should have been fortified with extensive obstacles and carefully sighted, weapons contained only hasty fighting positions occupied by soldiers whose equipment and morale indicated complete exhaustion. The contrast between German expectations and American realities became apparent as the encirclement tightened during the second week of April. German intelligence assessments had anticipated that American forces would require weeks or months to reduce organized resistance within the Ruhr Pocket. The rapid collapse of defensive positions and the increasing rate of surrenders indicated that German tactical doctrine had become completely obsolete when faced with American combined arms operations. By April 14, 1945, the psychological breaking point had been reached throughout Army Group B. American forces, advancing from north and south, met at Hagen, splitting the German pocket into two separate areas that could no longer support each other. The loss of communications between scattered formations eliminated any possibility of coordinated resistance or breakout operations. Model faced the most difficult decision of his military career. Standing in his command bunker, surrounded by maps that showed American forces advancing from all directions, he understood that continued resistance would result in the complete destruction of forces under his command without achieving any meaningful military objective. The choice between military honor and human compassion had never been starker or more personal. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The events of April 15th marked the beginning of the largest German surrender in Western Europe. Rather than formally capitulate to American forces, which would have required him to personally acknowledge defeat, Model chose to dissolve Army Group B and leave the decision to surrender to individual commanders and soldiers. This compromise between military honor and practical necessity reflected the impossible position that German field commanders faced when political directives contradicted tactical realities. Model's final order to his troops contained language that revealed the profound transformation in German military thinking that had occurred during the Ruhr Pocket campaign. Instructions to non-combatant personnel and Volkssturm militia to discard their uniforms and return to civilian life acknowledged that continued resistance served no purpose beyond the destruction of lives that could be saved through surrender. The human cost of Nazi fanaticism became apparent as German casualty statistics revealed the price of refusing to acknowledge military defeat. Approximately 10,000 German soldiers died during the Ruhr Pocket campaign, representing casualties that could have been avoided if rational surrender decisions had been made earlier in the fighting. These losses were particularly tragic because they occurred when the outcome of the war had already been determined by strategic factors beyond the control of individual battlefield commanders. American forces advancing into abandoned German positions discovered evidence of the complete breakdown in enemy morale and organization. Personal equipment, weapons, and military documents had been abandoned in quantities that indicated systematic collapse rather than organized withdrawal. The psychological impact of sustained defeat had destroyed the cohesion that had held German formations together through years of increasingly difficult campaigns. The mass surrender that followed, Model's dissolution of Army Group B, exceeded all American expectations in both scale and rapidity. Over 300,000 German soldiers chose capitulation over continued resistance, creating logistical challenges for American forces that had not anticipated such enormous numbers of prisoners. Temporary camps established in open fields stretched beyond the horizon, earning the designation Rhine meadow camps from German prisoners who found themselves confined in conditions that reflected the practical limitations of dealing with such massive surrenders. Individual German soldiers, interviewed by American intelligence officers, provided testimony that revealed the psychological factors behind their decision to surrender rather than continue fighting. Veterans of multiple campaigns described combat against American forces in terms that indicated fundamental changes in the tactical balance of power. The coordination between different American weapon systems exceeded anything they had encountered in previous theaters. The speed with which American commanders could concentrate overwhelming firepower at decisive points made traditional German defensive tactics ineffective. More significantly, these experienced soldiers recognized that American industrial capacity had created material advantages that could not be overcome through superior tactics or individual courage. German units that had learned to conserve ammunition and fuel through careful rationing faced American forces that seemed to possess unlimited supplies of everything necessary for sustained combat operations. The psychological impact of this disparity extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations to questions about the fundamental viability of continued resistance. Colonel Gunther Reichelm, one of Model's staff officers who survived the Pocket collapse, compiled observations that captured the broader implications of German defeat in the Ruhr. The systematic destruction of Army Group B had not merely eliminated one component of German military strength, it had demonstrated the complete obsolescence of Wehrmacht doctrine when faced with American forces that had learned to coordinate all available weapon systems into an integrated framework for achieving tactical objectives. The industrial significance of the Ruhr's capture extended beyond immediate military considerations to questions about Germany's ability to continue prosecuting the war. The region's coal mines and steel mills had provided essential materials for German weapons production since 1939. American control of these facilities ended any possibility that Germany could replace the equipment and supplies that had been lost during the previous months of fighting. Field Marshal Model's final hours reflected the personal dimension of Germany's military collapse. Unable to accept the dishonor of formal surrender and unwilling to witness the complete destruction of forces under his command, he chose suicide over capitulation. His last words to staff officers captured the profound psychological impact of systematic defeat by American forces that had exceeded every German expectation about enemy capabilities. "What remains for a commander after defeat?" Model asked Colonel Theodor Pilling on the afternoon of April 21st. In ancient times, they took poison. His decision to end, his life rather than surrender, reflected not only personal honor, but also the broader collapse of confidence that had affected German military leadership throughout the final months of the war. The strategic consequences of German failure in the Ruhr Pocket cascaded throughout the European theater, as Allied commanders recognized the opportunities created by enemy overextension. British and Canadian forces positioned in the northern sector of the front began preparations for offensive operations designed to exploit German weakness. French forces in the south advanced toward the Rhine without encountering significant resistance from demoralized German units that had lost all offensive capability. Most critically, the psychological impact of the Ruhr surrender extended to German forces throughout Western Europe, who understood that continued resistance was futile. Radio intercepts revealed conversations between German officers that indicated complete loss of confidence in their ability to achieve meaningful military objectives through continued fighting. The myth of German military invincibility had been systematically destroyed by American forces that had demonstrated professional competence, exceeding their enemies' most pessimistic assessments. The human dimension of German collapse was evident in the conduct of individual soldiers who had been forced to confront evidence that everything they had been taught about American military inferiority was false. Troops who had landed on European shores 8 months earlier with uncertain morale and limited combat experience now possessed the quiet confidence of professional soldiers who understood their tactical superiority over enemies who had previously been considered invincible. American casualties during the Ruhr Pocket campaign totaled approximately 10,000 killed, wounded, and missing, representing losses that could be replaced through normal reinforcement procedures. German casualties exceeded 30,000, dead and wounded, plus over 300,000 prisoners, representing the complete destruction of military capability in the Western theater. The disparity in casualty rates demonstrated the tactical advantages gained through superior coordination of all available weapon systems. The broader implications of American victory extended beyond immediate tactical considerations to questions about the fundamental nature of modern warfare. The Ruhr Pocket campaign had demonstrated that industrial capacity and tactical coordination could overcome traditional military advantages based on experience and individual skill. German forces that had terrorized Europe through the application of superior tactics and innovative operational concepts had been reduced to conducting futile defensive actions against enemies who possessed overwhelming material advantages. Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway's assessment of German surrender provided insight into the psychological transformation that had made mass capitulation possible. American intelligence officers compiled testimony from prisoners that revealed the scope of demoralization within German formations that had previously demonstrated exceptional cohesion under pressure. The tactical sophistication displayed by American forces had exceeded German expectations to such a degree that continued resistance seemed not only futile, but incomprehensible. The logistical challenges created by such massive numbers of German prisoners reflected the success of American tactical doctrine in achieving decisive results with minimal casualties. Temporary prison facilities established throughout the region housed German soldiers whose surrender had been motivated by recognition that American forces possessed capabilities that made traditional Wehrmacht tactics obsolete. The Rhine Meadow camps became symbols of German military collapse that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield to encompass fundamental questions about the viability of Nazi ideology. Weather conditions during the final week of fighting created additional hardships for German forces that lacked adequate supplies and equipment. Cold rain and persistent mud made defensive positions uncomfortable for troops who had been operating on starvation rations for weeks. American forces, protected by superior equipment and supplied through logistics networks that continued to function despite difficult conditions, maintained combat effectiveness while their enemies suffered from exposure and malnutrition that further reduced their will to resist. The silence that settled over the Ruhr region on April 18, 1945, marked more than the end of organized German resistance in one sector of the Western Front. It represented the death of Wehrmacht confidence that had sustained German military operations since the beginning of the war. American forces advancing through abandoned German positions discovered evidence of psychological collapse that extended far beyond questions of tactical defeat to encompass the fundamental assumptions about military superiority that had motivated Nazi aggression. The final irony of the Ruhr Pocket campaign lay in the reversal of roles that had occurred since American forces first landed in Europe. German troops who had once considered their enemies inferior had been systematically outfought by soldiers who had learned to coordinate all available weapons into an integrated framework for achieving tactical objectives. The transformation of American military capability from uncertain beginnings in North Africa to professional competence in Germany represented one of the most dramatic developments in military history. Captain Harry Wood of the 99th Infantry Division, who had participated in defensive actions at Elsenborn Ridge during the Battle of the Bulge, observed German prisoners during the final days of the Ruhr reduction and noted the complete absence of the arrogance that had characterized Wehrmacht attitudes during earlier campaigns. These were defeated soldiers who understood that they had been systematically outclassed by enemies who possessed tactical capabilities that exceeded anything in German military doctrine. The psychological impact of American victory extended far beyond the immediate battlefield to German forces throughout Europe who recognized that continued resistance was impossible. Radio communications, intercepted by Allied intelligence services, revealed the scope of demoralization that had affected Wehrmacht units from Norway to Austria. The demonstration of American military superiority in the Ruhr had convinced German commanders that their forces lacked the capability to achieve meaningful tactical objectives through continued fighting. Model's suicide on April 21st represented more than the death of one field marshal. It symbolized the collapse of Wehrmacht confidence that had sustained German military operations through 4 years of increasingly difficult campaigns. His final words to staff officers reflected the profound psychological transformation that had occurred as German forces confronted evidence of American tactical superiority that exceeded their most pessimistic assessments. The strategic significance of German surrender in the Ruhr Pocket became apparent within days as reports reached Allied Supreme Headquarters. The elimination of Army Group B had removed Germany's final strategic reserve in the Western Theatre, making organized resistance impossible west of the Elbe River. More critically, the demonstration of American capabilities had convinced German forces throughout Europe that continued fighting served no meaningful purpose beyond the unnecessary destruction of lives that could be saved through surrender. The human cost of Nazi fanaticism was evident in casualty statistics that revealed the price of political directives that prohibited rational military decisions based on tactical realities. German losses during the Ruhr Pocket fighting represented casualties that could have been avoided if commanders had been permitted to acknowledge the hopelessness of their strategic situation. The gap between political rhetoric and battlefield reality had widened to the point where military operations had become exercises in systematic self-destruction. Individual German soldiers who survived the Ruhr Pocket encirclement provided testimony that captured the broader implications of their defeat. Veterans of multiple campaigns described American tactical coordination in terms that indicated fundamental changes in the nature of modern warfare. The integration of infantry, artillery, armor, and air support into a coherent framework for achieving battlefield objectives had exceeded anything they had encountered during years of combat on multiple fronts. The material evidence of German collapse was visible throughout the abandoned positions as American forces completed the reduction of the pocket. Equipment that represented months of industrial production lay scattered across the battlefield, abandoned by troops who had lost confidence in their ability to use it effectively. Personal belongings and military documents created a trail of debris that told the story of formations that had disintegrated rather than retreated in organized fashion. By April 25, 1945, the strategic initiative had passed completely to Allied forces, who now possessed the tactical confidence and operational flexibility necessary to complete the liberation of Western Europe. The surrender of over 300,000 German troops in the Ruhr Pocket had demonstrated that Wehrmacht resistance was no longer capable of achieving meaningful military objectives. The myth of German military superiority had been systematically destroyed by American forces, who had learned to fight with professional competence that exceeded their enemies' expectations. The broader significance of American victory in the Ruhr Pocket extended beyond immediate tactical considerations to questions about the fundamental nature of industrial warfare. The coordination of all available weapon systems into an integrated framework for achieving battlefield objectives represented the maturation of military doctrine that would influence armed conflict for decades. German forces that had once terrorized Europe through the application of superior tactics and operational concepts had been reduced to conducting futile resistance against enemies who possessed overwhelming advantages in both material and tactical sophistication. The transformation of American military capability from uncertain beginnings to professional dominance represented one of the most remarkable developments in the history of warfare. Soldiers who had struggled during early campaigns in North Africa and Sicily had learned to coordinate complex combined arms operations that systematically dismantled enemy resistance through the application of overwhelming firepower at decisive points. The psychological impact of this transformation extended far beyond immediate battlefield results to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between industrial capacity and military effectiveness. Lieutenant Colonel Stanley Smith's after-action report, filed with 1st Army Headquarters on April 22, provided detailed analysis of tactical methods that had achieved such decisive results with minimal American casualties. The coordination of artillery fires with infantry operations had exceeded theoretical projections developed during pre-war training exercises. The integration of air support with ground operations had created battlefield conditions that made traditional defensive tactics obsolete. The final German withdrawal from positions throughout Western Europe began during the pre-dawn hours of April 26, conducted by units that had lost all offensive capability and most defensive effectiveness. Radio intercepts revealed the desperation of German commanders, who were attempting to preserve what remained of their formations, while complying with political directives that prohibited acknowledgement of military defeat. The gap between Hitler's expectations and battlefield reality had widened to the point where rational military decision-making was impossible within the German command structure. As American patrols advanced through abandoned German positions throughout the region, they discovered evidence of the complete breakdown in enemy morale and discipline that had made mass surrender inevitable. The psychological impact of systematic tactical defeat had destroyed the cohesion that had held Wehrmacht formations together through years of increasingly difficult campaigns across multiple theaters of operation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.